Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Queen Comes to Power by Chloe C. Peñaranda, narrated by Elisabeth Lagelee. Prologue. Reuben. Darkness. That was all he knew. The darkness of a cold, barren cell, of his desolate thoughts, of a lingering death. What he dreaded most was the darkness that took his sight as he was led from the prison, his sanctuary. He did not fear the bars that kept him in, as long as they kept the monsters out. Every time they came for him, he was blindfolded but not restrained, as though they knew terror gripped his ability to move beyond the vacant steps he took, guided by a hand that held him loosely. To run or fight, he didn't have that courage, not even when a childhood friend's voice urged a response in him. Nothing was worse than the feeble submission he'd been reduced to. To grapple onto his fading sanity, Reuben thought of Faythe, of his mother, of Jacon and everyone else he left in High Pharaoh. He didn't know how much time had passed since he was met with his terrible fate. A door opened with a faint creak. More shuffling. He wasn't embarrassed by his fumbling footsteps. Part of him hoped to trip himself, if only to delay the confrontation for a few seconds longer. Then they halted. Reuben couldn't hide his trembling. His blindfold was snatched away. He kept his eyes closed for a moment longer, wishing for darkness in place of the piercing light that tried to penetrate his lids. When he found the courage to flutter them open, he blinked rapidly to adjust, and upon spying the waves of flaming red hair across the room, his heart began to pound. She kept her back to him for a moment, looking out over the clearest waters and purest crystalline snow from the wall made completely of glass. Reuben stood still. Despite the warmth of the room, he felt as cold as the icy sheets that sparkled beyond. The beautiful Faythe twisted to him like an elegant wisp of wind, but the fire in her blazing amber eyes was ice-cold as she fixed them on him. "I have offered you everything," she said, her voice sending a shiver to make every hair on his body stand. "Everything you could dream of in your miserable human life, for your allegiance to me. Yet still, you resist." The enchantress floated to him, slow steps that lapped the waves of her gown like a ruby sea. "Why?" Reuben couldn't speak. His answer was there, but it was wholly traitorous to her plan. He could not betray the names he chanted nightly in his lonely cell. He could not betray the one she sought the most. The red-haired face stopped close enough to touch, and his whole body stiffened. How could such evil lie within such devastating beauty? A combination of the most lethal kind. She raised a delicate, slender hand, and Reuben flinched. Her fingers curled around his jaw, turning his face to hold her stare when he tried to avoid it, for the color struck him with conflicting emotions. "You let your fear consume you. It is not your fault." Her hand caressed his cheek, a loving gesture that held no true endearment. "I really hoped it would not come to this, Rue." When he tried to look away again, her fingers gripped his jaw with more force. Her sharp nails dug into his skin, and he winced. "I am going to break you," she hissed so beautifully, but laced with poison. "Only then can I mold you into my own perfect weapon. Only then will you see that I stand to better this world." She stepped forward, and he had no choice but to retreat backward while she held him firm. He stumbled all the way until he hit solid wood and became trapped. Before he could even consider the thought of a possible escape, he felt another presence there, in his mind. A gasp and coils of shadows were circling his thoughts, searching, listening. They formed into claws, scraping along every corner, violating every private memory. Everything he was surfaced at their command. Then, without warning, fire erupted in his head. Reuben screamed, but the echo around the room was swiftly cut off. His cry still rang in his mind, and her hold on his chin loosened to begin a soothing caress of his face once again. "It will be over in a moment," she cooed. Every time one of those shadow talons sank themselves deep, they scorched a new line of searing pain until they nestled in his mind, again and again and again. They would kill him, each wicked claw taking hold to shatter him completely from within. He felt the darkness calling. This one he welcomed. A darkness so free and final. Just before he could fall into that blissful oblivion, everything stilled. He closed and opened his eyes. Quiet, peaceful nothing. The stars that scattered his vision began to fade. He didn't fear. He didn't feel anything. He looked down at the presence in front of him, and she was the most breathtaking thing he had ever laid eyes upon. Fire with the heat of 1,000 suns. He wanted to fall to his knees before such a magnificent creature. As her touch on his face registered, he felt the need to return it. Slowly, his hand raised to cup her cheek, and she smiled. It wasn't sweet or kind or tender. It was pure blazing triumph. Both her hands laced through his hair and tangled there as she brought her face to his. He didn't object, didn't want to retreat as he kissed her back. He felt nothing from it, but the way she moved was all he cared about. His kiss seemed to please her. When she pulled back abruptly, the curl of her rouge-painted lips was nothing short of devastating. Reuben shivered. "You are mine," she purred. "I am yours." He would kill for her. He would bleed for her. He would do anything for her. Chapter 1. Faythe. As the king's spymaster hurtled through the bright, white hallways, the tapestries and sculptures blurred into waves of deep blue and white. The fast clap of her feet against the marble overtook the tempo of her racing heart. Her lungs burned, breathing uneven and short from the exertion of her sprint. In her urgency, she skidded and twisted around the few servants who littered the hallways. They shrieked, attempting to dart out of her way before she could knock them off their feet, and she called her apologies to them over her shoulder, not slowing her pace at all. The tail of her jacket billowed behind her, along with wisps of her half-unbound hair. With her neck on the line, she didn't have time to consider how frantic she would appear to those she passed. The few guards she came across were halfway to drawing their swords, their fey ears alerted to Faythe's fast thundering footsteps long before she came into view. Upon seeing who was to blame for the commotion, they relaxed, and she winced at their disapproving glares and disgruntled headshakes. She was already running dangerously late and had decided to take the long route to the council chamber to surreptitiously enter through the back door instead of the front, hoping no one would notice her tardiness, especially not the King of High Pharaoh. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her breaths cut like broken glass in her throat as she stumbled clumsily around the last corner into the dark, narrow passage that led to where the Lord's meeting was due to take place. Damn rutting spirits, let it be delayed. It was all she could do to keep her jittering nerves at bay. 2 royal guards stood posted outside, and Faythe slowed to a walk as she approached, straightening the jacket of her uniform while regaining her composure. At first she had felt ridiculous when she was presented with the royal blue and silver accented attire that closely resembled that of the guards. It was far too elegant and formal for her to ever feel accustomed to. The only distinguishing feature the guards had was their shorter jacket and the matching blue shoulder cloak Faythe was spared from trailing behind her all day. "You're lucky. A few of the lords are still to arrive," the guard Caius said. He was one of the friendlier Faythe had become acquainted with during her 3 months in the castle. Younger than most, he was the first in the guard to ease her tensions, and she'd even come to consider him a friend. In fact, she was pleasantly surprised by just how many of the guards had warmly welcomed her into their ranks, albeit she still felt at odds being shuffled among brute warriors. Nothing they could dress her in or title her with would ever be enough to make her blend in, and it had taken a long while to get used to. There was also a large number in the guard who remained uneasy about her presence in the citadel, specifically for her ability, and she couldn't blame them when they avoided her eye. She was only here for her talents, after all, as the king's reluctant spy master. It was only natural to be untrusting of anyone with such a title, and they knew that if the king commanded it, she would be at his mercy to invade any one of their thoughts. "That's me, just a fountain of luck," she grumbled flatly. "Damn, a loose button." She fumbled to knot it closed, muttering curses under her breath. Caius chuckled at her flustering as she checked over the rest of the attire she'd all but flung onto her body before flying out of her rooms. The other guard didn't even try to hide a scowl, and she pinched her face right back at him in irritation. She was running late thanks to this morning's training session with Toria. What was intended to be a quickly crammed-in solo hour in the weapons room ahead of the grueling meeting had turned into an intense combat lesson with the king's ward, who had tracked her down there. They lost the concept of time. Faythe became fully engrossed in learning maneuvers with a long staff instead of steel. It was Toria's weapon of choice, and apparently a custom in her home kingdom of Fenstead. One of the most dumbfounding revelations Faythe had learned about the golden-skinned beauty was that above being the King of High Pharaoh's ward, she was the sole heir to the Fenstead throne. Princess Toria Stagnite. Lost in the action with iron-tipped wood, it was only when Faythe's wonderful handmaidens Elise and Ingrid came looking for her that she was enlightened to the time. She sprinted to her rooms to frantically dress before hurling herself halfway across the castle to make the congregation on time. The king never let her forget that her life hung in the balance of his mercy, and it made her constantly on edge that he always seemed to be looking for a reason to go back on the bargain to spare her life. One slip-up could result in the end of her days, and not just in the castle. Caius's quiet rumble of laughter sounded at her back as she stepped up to the door, creaked it open, and slid in through the smallest gap she could manage. The low chatter of voices disguised any noise from the shallow creak of its hinges and her deliberately light footsteps. Upon discovering the meeting had yet to begin, Faythe sighed a breath of relief that dropped a weight of mercy in her stomach. She noted the few empty chairs yet to be filled. The king's council chamber was far smaller than the throne room, but still big enough to warrant 4 guards. They were posted 2 to each wall, standing formally parallel to each other. A massive, deep oak table occupied the center, at the head of which the king was already seated in his grand throne with his back to her. Prince Nicolaus was to his left, and spied Faythe as soon as she entered, shooting an amused smirk in her direction. She glowered, not paying him any attention as she glided in and took up position against one of the walls, an even space away from the other guards. She stood straight and poised, clasping her hands behind her back, and didn't dare a glance in the king's direction to see if he'd noticed her late arrival. More lords of High Pharaoh filed through the door until every seat was filled. Then the ornate main doors were closed so the meeting could begin. This wasn't Faythe's first time being used for her ability. Not even close. The king had several different gatherings with lords, councilmen, war generals, and other members of the royal court on at least a weekly basis. In the beginning, she struggled with morality for what she was doing, and had to swallow her revulsion at herself for what she was, peering into the minds of the unwitting subjects. She had learned to live with it by not diving too deep, unless there was threat or suspicion. She had to live with it, and she knew she could shoulder the burden of a tarnished soul as long as it kept her friends safe. Most of the time, Faythe was only forced to listen to her own bored thoughts and the occasional rude remark about the king's actions and strategies. But Orlon would quickly find her of little use if she never reported anything he didn't already know. So, while it pained her to do so, she had exposed a couple of council members who were conspiring against him, an entirely foolhardy plan, as well as a lord who sought to gain more power and wealth through illegal trade. She never learned the outcome of their fates, nor did she particularly want to, preferring to remain blissfully ignorant to her third-party involvement in their probable deaths. Faythe had become fully acquainted with her ability, and it no longer doused her with dread to use it. Instead, she harnessed it, became the power that hummed in her veins, far more prominent since those first months of teaching with Nick that seemed so distant now. Her time as spymaster had at least earned her practice and taught her self-control. Collecting thoughts had become like breathing air, and the deeper skeletons those in high places often harbored, they were a game to find, something to offer the tedious meetings a little entertainment. While an ignorant eye would glance over the room and see a gathering of highly respected courtly individuals who carried themselves with an air of importance, Faythe saw what they truly were inside. A congregation of greed, adultery, and spite. There were other stems of her ability she was less acquainted with. Faythe had only been made to use compulsion once, during a vote for the king's proposal to remove the Fey soldiers stationed in the town of Galmire. This would leave the town on High Pharaoh's Edge, which shared a border with the conquered kingdom of Dalrune, completely defenseless. The king was many hands short, but with a subtle glance at Faythe, the scales miraculously tipped in his favor. Faythe knew Galmire was a fully human-occupied settlement, which made her part in securing the vote hurt like a painful twist of the dagger, constantly piercing her chest. It was not something she was proud of, but it was certainly not her place to have a voice on any of the matters brought into the council chamber. The meeting was fully underway now, and Faythe had already met the eye of all the lords facing her and captured a glimpse into their minds. It was easy enough to project a thought for them to look at her, and once she caught their eye, she no longer needed to hold their stare. Even when they quickly averted their gazes from the strange human standing in the shadows, she would still be riffling around their heads. They all noted her presence with a curiosity and distaste that was strongly reflected in their thoughts, loud and clear for her to hear. Their obliviousness was too amusing for Faythe to be insulted by their internal slander. The only humans any of them were used to were the ones who kept their goblets topped up. Faythe no longer felt bad for the invasion of their minds, finding most of the lords to be as imperious and arrogant as the king himself. Faythe inconspicuously floated herself around to the other side of the room to stand mirroring her previous position, as she always did, and began probing into the minds of the lords who had been seated with their backs to her. It was deliriously dull, and she was exhausted from her exertion that morning, both in the training room and her wild sprint. Her eyelids drooped a couple of times, and she was jerked awake every time a new voice fought to be the loudest in the room. She didn't pay any attention to the tiresome affairs they conversed, or rather argued about, instead counting the minutes internally with no way of knowing how much time had passed. After what she gauged to be close to an hour, the king bellowed over the petty squabbling of Faythe, silencing the room immediately. Faythe refrained from slouching in relief as he relayed his conclusion to the rather pointless formal gathering. The only time she ever longed to hear the wicked ruler's voice was to signal that yet another exasperating meeting was adjourned. The lords of High Pharaoh stood, chatting idly to each other as they slowly filed out of the room. She watched each of their backs as they exited, far too slow in her impatience. The king and prince remained in their seats, and Faythe didn't flinch from her position until every other noble set of pointed ears had left and the grand doors were closed once again. Faythe visibly relaxed the moment she heard them groan shut, rolling her stiff shoulders before sauntering over to the king. She stopped and braced her hands on the back of an empty chair. "Anything to report?" the king asked, sounding as bored as she felt. She rubbed her right temple. "Lord Devon thinks he's being very undermined, and that his lands are not big enough, if that interests you." The king only scoffed. She went on anyway. "Lord Vactus feels your plans for the fortification's defenses are weak, but he's too afraid to speak out. Lord Folly detests the sound of your voice. The repetition of the word fool was hard to ignore. But you can't please them all, right?" The king's jaw flexed at the insult, while the prince's mouth twitched at one corner, fighting back amusement. "No one's planning or conspiring against you as of late. It's all getting a bit dull, really." Orlon leaned back in his mighty chair, propping an elbow on the velvet-clad arm to hold his powerful jaw in quiet contemplation. He didn't need the grandeur of a throne to assert his dominance, as it radiated across the hall, yet she couldn't imagine him seated in anything less. Faythe stayed silent, waiting for her dismissal, which was usually quick. When he didn't immediately relieve her of duty for the afternoon, her stomach started to knot with dread. Orlon took a long breath before he spoke again. "High Pharaoh is to host King Varlas of Olmstone and King Agalor of Ryanel next week. They will be staying with us for 1 week for the king's meetings." Faythe's fingers curled around the wood of the chair tighter out of nervousness. She silently damned the spirits to burn, already anticipating the dangerous proposition that was about to fall on her shoulders. "I shall require your presence to confirm their loyalty and the alliance is true, and I should like to find out their defense plans for their kingdoms, above what they might disclose." Hearing it out loud still made her blanch in horror at the thought of prying into the minds of the ancient and powerful rulers of Engardia. She dropped her limp arms to her sides. "With all due respect, Your Majesty." "Let me be clear. It is not a request," he said firmly, swiftly cutting off her protest. I hope you have mastered your little mind tricks, Spy Master. If one of them discovers you poking around, make no mistake. I will gladly hand you over to them and deny any knowledge." Faythe swallowed hard, though it did nothing to relieve the dry pain in her throat. King Orlan waited expectantly, and she reluctantly offered a small nod of obedience. A sly, satisfied smile spread wide across his cruel face. The look twisted her gut. Then he waved a lazy hand in dismissal, and she stumbled back a step, bowing her head before twisting sharply to storm for the exit, desperate to leave before the air in the council chamber became too thick to inhale. Making haste through the doors, she remained rigid, marching through the halls while her mind reeled over the insanely daunting task bestowed upon her. She had only just grown accustomed to filtering through the minds of the lords of High Pharaoh, and she had the protection of the king if she happened to be discovered. He would be able to silence any of them to keep his secret weapon from public knowledge. To spy into the mind of another king, however, there would be no salvation if she were caught, and the consequences didn't bear thinking about. Her hands trembled, and she clamped her fists tight, fingernails biting into her palms out of fear and anger. She felt hot and restricted, unbuttoning her jacket in the hall before her rooms, thinking she might suffocate if she waited any longer. She wanted to burn the uniform to ash, the thing that made her shackles as the king's slave visible for all to see. Barging through her chamber doors, she tore the royal blue coat from her shoulders, tossing it onto the bed and untying the top of her shirt to allow the air to breeze across her chest. Hauling open the balcony doors next, she took a long, deep breath of the bitter winter air that had chased away the autumn all at once last month. Winter was always the longest season, but Faythe welcomed the extended nights and chilly wind. The sun didn't shy in the presence of the coldest season, and still beamed its powerful rays down on the marvelous, impeccable city. The reflections off the tall glass and white stone made it a sea of glittering crystal to look upon. Today's sun offered no warmth, but as a tendril of its light fell on her face when she stepped out farther, Faythe closed her eyes at the comforting feeling. When she opened them again, she thought she could feel the ethereal presence that embraced her through those rays, bringing the goddess of the sun to mind. She had not visited Aurealis since her last rocky encounter with the spirit of life. Over 3 months later, that felt like a lifetime ago. Everything had changed, within herself and in her turn of circumstances. While her soul remained bound to the eternal woods until she returned the temple ruin, a reckless bargain made in the heat of a desperate moment, her mortal existence had now befallen a different kind of life sentence, a permanent tether to the king of High Pharaoh. She had nothing left to barter with, and had recently felt the crushing confinement and hideous notion of not belonging to herself any more. What hurt the most, and what had kept Faythe in low spirits since the day she signed her life away to the demon in the castle, was the heavy weight of sadness at her human friends being ripped away from her. They were safe, which was all she could be grateful for in the darkness, but it didn't ease the ache in her heart from their absence. To assert his control, or perhaps to torture her further, the king had ordered that she was not permitted to leave the castle grounds even with guards. The stone walls had slowly been closing in on her, close to shattering her spirit completely if she was stuck between them any longer. Faythe owed a lot of her remaining sanity to Toria. It was amusing to think how they'd met, with Faythe holding a dagger to her throat to get the king's attention. They'd laughed over it later, after Faythe profusely apologized, guilty at knowing how kind and welcoming the ward really was. The shape of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?